So with that, I just think that Herman Perchner, there could be no one better. He's been a partner of ours through all of these times. He put us in business. In fact, when I say the security dialogues came out of the general conferences that we ran for Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic ambitions, Herman was there at the beginning. And so I couldn't ask for a better figure to take this very important issue and chair it. Okay. Herman, it's all yours.
Thank you, Walter. It's been a privilege of the American Foreign Policy Council to be involved in these conferences over many years, as well as many other activities in Ukraine. I'm especially interested in this panel because one of the very hot topics, of course, will aircraft be provided to Ukraine, and when will it be provided? And I think while all of us in this room are in favor of that, many of us, myself included, are not military experts. And to help us better make our argument, we're going to listen carefully to what the panelists have to say. We'll know more about how long it takes to train pilots, how the aircraft will be used, what the consequences will be if they're delayed, what ability people will have with minimal training versus longer training and related issues. And starting this off will be General Breedlove. Everybody knows him as the Supreme Commander of Allied Commander of NATO, having been Vice Chairman of the Air Force, and also someone with combat experience. I think you can't be involved in Ukraine without having listened to him many times and read interviews that he's participated in. So without any delay, we'll turn the floor over to the General, and we'll all be listening very attentively.
Okay, I think we fixed the mic problems before. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, great. So I see this as the tale of two air forces. One, the Russian Air Force, a large air force with flashy equipment, seemingly capable and highly touted around the world. And the Ukrainian Air Force, a very small comparatively air force, using old Russian equipment and not very celebrated around the world. As we acknowledge those two starting points, we have to look at how have these two air forces performed so far in this conflict. First of all, the Russian Air Force has demonstrated that it is unable to do suppression of enemy air defenses, a very important item in today's Air Force acumen. It has also established that it's unable to complete and hold air superiority over its forces. And it has demonstrated a complete lack of ability to really participate in what we all would call combined arms warfare. The Ukrainian Air Force, despite its limited size and its equipment, has been able to establish a certain degree of air defense, enough to stymie most Russian actions, but not all. It has been able to establish limited ground support in face of strong Russian opposition and surface-to-air threats. And it has been able to establish a certain limited level of ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. I place this all squarely on the basis of what I would call some very brave, some very smart, and some highly tactical actions by a small, less capable Air Force. And so while their effect on the battlefield has been somewhat limited, they are punching way above their weight and performing far better than we expected them to. So what are the surprises that I see so far in this war? First is the failure of the Russian Air Force. I think that we have seen a complete lack of training and exercising the way that we exercise in the West against strong opposition and exercising to failure to understand our problems. I think we see the effects of limited flying time for their pilots, and most of that flying time being in the basics. I see a complete lack of ability to strike at long range with precision. And that has been evidenced in so much of what we have seen in their attack on soft civilian targets that are easier to hit. The other surprise, I think, as I mentioned before, is just the innovation of the Ukrainian Air Force. It has done very well. In those very first few days, they did a great job of shell gaming their defenses and saving them from those two massive barrages early. And the other thing I would say the Ukrainians are teaching the entire world now is the ability of drones and very small drones to be incredibly effective on the battlefield. All you have to do is watch the daily Twitter feed of the over-the-counter drones dropping grenades precisely into the hatches of tanks and into the dugouts of the Russian soldiers. Having celebrated so much already, I would say that there are some bad lessons being learned. There are people looking at the failure of the Russian Air Force, and there are people looking at the limitations primarily on size and age on Ukraine, and they are drawing conclusions that talk to the demise of air power in a conflict. I could not disagree more with these conclusions, and I would say that if we had seen what Western style and capability of air forces early in this fight, when all of those tanks were piled up on the north side of Kyiv, we would have seen something that would have made the highway of death in the first Gulf War pale. So what do the Ukrainians need? I want to applaud earlier speakers in saying that what Ukrainians first and foremost need is U.S. and Western policy. And that is the policy that we've talked about with two of the speakers, that is Ukraine to win this war. Don't stop short in the policy like our current administration is stopping short by describing that they're going to be there for how long or give them how much. We need to add the descriptor of to win. And if we add the descriptor of to win, it makes everything else I'm about to talk about very easy. 4 things I think Ukraine needs to be able to do to establish local and battlefield air superiority over their main effort. Second, I believe that Ukraine needs to have a complete Western-style integration of integrated air and missile defenses. This takes kit to sense, kit to characterize, and kit to engage and kill. So it is broader than any one tool. Ukraine needs long-range precise strike, first in the form of ATACMS because they can field it and use it almost immediately. And then second in the range in the realm of 4+ generation aircraft, the F-16 being a great example. And then finally, we need to first eliminate sanctuary in policy. Our policy has established sanctuary for Ukraine or for Russia almost 300 degrees around Ukraine. Russia is allowed by our Western policy to shoot into Ukraine from the northwest regions of Belarus all the way around to the northwest regions of the Black Sea. And this is simply because we forbid Ukraine from firing back with the weapons that we give them. We need to eliminate the sanctuary that has been established by U.S. policy. And finally, I would just say that rather than talk about independent weapon systems, which we all know, and I have already mentioned two of them, the most critical, the ATACMS and a 4+ generation fighter aircraft. We need to stop worrying about the eaches when it comes to weapons and talk about capabilities. And I will get off the stage with the 4 things that I said I believe they need most. Local battlefield air superiority that would be established by both aircraft and missile defenses, an integrated air and missile defense system that takes the entire range of sensing, marries it to command and control, and then gives it the capability to engage. We need to give Ukraine long-range strike right now in the form of ATACMS and begin right now training pilots for 4+ generation fighting. And then in both policy and capability to strike, we need to eliminate the sanctuary that we have built for Russia. Thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you. Walter's just informed me that General Kremenetsky has been called to the Pentagon and will not be able to join us. So we're going to move directly to Peter Wilson, who's a senior defense policy analyst at RAND. He's a man that has a lecture relationship at Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, NDU, probably some others, and has a long history of specialization in the use of high tech in national defense policy.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Just give a slight note about my background. My perspective about all of this is from the point of view of trying to understand the implications of military technological innovation from a historical point of view, as well as in the belief that if you don't understand the past, it's very difficult to understand where you are today, much less forecasting anything about the future. And I also will remind you about any discussion about the future, even necessarily the near term, especially dealing with military affairs, is that often the comment that's apt is the future isn't what it used to be. So be it from that point of view. I'd like to make some comments about the relationship between air power and ground power, and that is the previous panel. And you could argue that the fact that the way we have set up this presentation reflects an organizational conceptual pathology. And that is what we should be talking about, as alluded to by General Breedlove, is developing a systemic combined arms view about what kind of assets can be provided to the Ukrainians to affect military success at what time frame. And this is often lost amongst the commentariat who are focusing on what's the new gizmo we should be headlining today. And in most particular, the discussion about manned combat aircraft of the 4th generation, such as the F-16 or the JA-39, which has been touted as a much better aircraft for Ukrainians' use, etc. The reality, and there's an excellent article in the War on the Rocks about this by a former EW fighter pilot about all of this, which I recommend that you all read, which is the extraordinary challenge of training pilots who have had experience with Soviet-era aircraft to transition to 4th generation fighters. I would cite, by the way, the case of both the Egyptian Air Force as well as the Polish Air Force, that there was a protracted effort. So one of the real challenges, and I agree with General Breedlove on this, that given the time, the length of time of training and preparing to operate NATO 4th generation aircraft, we're talking about something that's measured, in my opinion, in the terms of at least 18 months that you might get pilots and capacity that would be meaningful. Therefore, when we talk about modernizing their Air Force, what we really have to talk about, insofar as the context of Ukrainian military success for the summer, for example, is how do we help the Ukrainian extant Air Force with Warsaw Pact aircraft perform better? And there we've already seen one big success, and that is the introduction of the HARM anti-radiation missile on board Soviet aircraft. And that's been apparently a quite successful transition. The other innovation which has emerged over the course of this winter, again, obscured by this debate about F-16s or not, is the provision of what is called JDAMs, which is the GPS-guided dumb bomb that has been converted into a guided bomb, and that there is what is known as a boost glide variant. This is a bomb which has small pop-out wings, not unlike a cruise missile, and provides you with the capacity to loft the bomb at some distance, measured in tens of miles, where the fighter bomber comes in at low altitude, pitches up, and lofts the bomb towards a designated target. Also, the other not unrelated capability that has emerged is, for all of the focus on ATACMS, a more significant weapon may now be being provided in mass, and that is the ground-launched small diameter bomb. And what is that? Is basically you attach the rocket motor that's associated, which is the rocket motor that propels the long-range guided mobile rocket that is used extensively and successfully by the Ukrainians, attach it to a bomb that we developed for our air operations in the Middle East, which is again a glide bomb. And what this provides you with is a weapon of a range of roughly 150 kilometers, which is quite substantial and also very accurate. And the other attraction compared to ATACMS is there's a lot of surplus rocket motors attached to multiple bomblet systems, which are now judged as not usable by both European and US armed forces. And we have produced thousands of these small diameter bombs, which we've used extensively in our air operations. So the attraction of this is the prospect of a new major upgrade in the long range precision fires. And again, what the Ukrainians have demonstrated, and I agree with General Breedlove's cautions about this. What does this imply to the future of air power? But I do believe, not unlike the war between Russia and Japan in 1904, 1905, we have some strong hints of the future. And in this case, I do believe we're seeing the accelerated robotization of warfare and a changed relationship between piloted or personed or manned air power in long-range fires and robotization surveillance. One of the interesting questions we'll find out, as Laurie Freeman remarked in an article recently, can the Ukrainians successfully carry out large-scale mechanized counteroffensive operations above and beyond what they've done in Kharkiv and the retaking of Kherson? Can they conduct such operations to break, in essence, the Russian army, which, by the way, I do believe, because what's happened here to the Russian army is basically a form of, how shall I call it, degeneration from a modern combined arms mechanized army to one that looks frankly more like the People's Liberation Army of 1950-51, mass infantry and artillery. By the way, the Tsarist army of 1917 would see considerable similarity and possibly be a critic of its performance. The point being is that the Russian army does not have unlimited human resources. This, in my opinion, is a popular assumption. The reality is that with the appropriate capabilities and as well as the additional improved mechanized capabilities, the combined capability of the Ukrainians with continued assistance here, especially the use of precision guided munitions, I don't think we fully appreciated what an extraordinary change in the character of warfare this is. For those of you who have had naturally no experience in this affair, I recommend that you go see the latest movie produced called All Quiet on the Western Front. If you want to get a sense of the character of the fighting that's going on right now in Donbass. But the reality here is that with the correct assault tactics, mechanized assault tactics available and training by the Ukrainians using precision fires at all distances, coupled with the fact that we are providing them with very large numbers of drones of all kinds of characteristics, those that acquire targets for long-range indirect fire, as well as what we call loitering munitions or kamikaze drones, which have been used extensively on both sides. You couple that with precision-guided artillery, as well as rockets, etc. You have the capacity here to see the Ukrainian army have a counteroffensive sometime when the dry zone reemerges, May, June, etc., and a Russian army that might be well primed for collapse. I would be that optimistic, if you will. I don't see how this war drags on much past this summer. Naturally, I was frankly expecting this army to collapse last August. Didn't happen. But the question here is, we have to start to think about what this war portends, not just in the sense of the future of combat per se, is also we should start encouraging our Ukrainian friends to start thinking about how does it function, what is its national security strategy after the war? And that is, I would argue strongly, we have to start thinking in terms about what's sustainable for Ukraine in the context of a new security environment. And I would argue that Vladimir Putin, in many ways, is the godfather of many things. And one of the things he's a godfather of, in my opinion, is the creation of a modern, dynamic, energized Ukraine. And I would also argue a re-energized Atlantic Alliance, which isn't a sign of strategic genius on his part. And so therefore, the question is, and as it's been discussed in this room about what is victory, it's quite clear, as it was pointed out earlier, that with these precision munitions, even without ATACMS, in fact, the weapon I mentioned to you before, deployed in very large numbers, if the Ukrainians are capable of taking Melitopol, for example, which is a key logistics node further south, and pushing forward, most of Ukraine is then under the range of the intermediate weapon I described to you, the ground-launched small diameter bomb, much less other capabilities that I described to you. So again, the whole issue is how do you encourage and help develop a vibrant combined arms capability that takes advantage of assets that are available today. The manned fighter bomber, the fourth generation fighter bomber story, frankly, from my point of view, yes, it's political symbolic as much as anything, the commitment to providing that to the Ukrainians, committing to a pathway. But frankly, those aircraft are not going to, quote unquote, win the war for Ukraine. We are, again, the question comes back down to the table from a military defense planner's point of view is what are the implications of this first large war in the 21st century? We hope it's the first and the last, but we, unfortunately, many of us in this room remember vividly Frank Fukuyama's concept of the end of history. Well, history is returned. As Leon Trotsky said, you may not be interested in war, but war can become interested in you. And that's what's happened to all of us. And so again, I would appeal to planners both here in the United States and also in Europe and in Ukraine to start thinking in terms, as we did in 1944, 45, the planning for Bretton Woods, etc., the plans about the post-war world. I'll make another final comment where I do believe we are in the middle, from a war point of view, the middle of the opera. The fat lady hasn't sung. And the fat lady singing is the question which was raised in the previous panel so well, which is what happens when Crimea falls? And that is the signal question. And I am not quite as sanguine as Ambassador Herbst. I wouldn't call it timidity. I'd call it actually prudence. And that is, the reality is we are fighting a nuclear-armed great power over very high stakes. And I will also remind you, from a historian's point of view, this is not unlike our situation in the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, etc. Restraint in the context of an opponent that's armed with nuclear weapons is going to be the feature of one of these conflicts. So we should not be too sanguine that we aren't going to go through a major nuclear crisis sometime this summer by the very product of Ukraine's military success. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm reminded that when General Pilsudski beat Trotsky's Red Army in 1920, and Lenin, cutting his losses, made a peace that involved ceding land. When he was attacked, he defended the treaty by saying, "We need peace now. When we're stronger, we'll take it back." And to that end, I was encouraged that with the comment that we need to think about the long-term security, and 18 months of training for new aircraft may not be relevant for Crimea today, but it's going to be relevant certainly in the future. Let's open up to questions.
I have two. One is, do you know what is hitting Mariupol? Two questions. One, do you know what has been hitting Mariupol? And the second, is it possible, or do you believe that unmanned aviation can replace manned aviation in terms of combined arms maneuver, particularly for the upcoming Crimean offensive? Thanks.
The first answer is easy. I don't know. I can only surmise what the weapon systems might be in these attacks. Again, if they have further success going south, punching south, again, just do the go to a map and get a string, as they say, and find out what the range is of the ground-launched small diameter weapon. And if the Ukrainians have success on the ground, which again will be largely a artillery, if you will, surveillance, to use the Russian Soviet term of art, which meant some of you may not be aware of. This emerged at the very end of the Cold War. General Orgarkov and others, they coined the phrase the reconnaissance strike, reconnaissance fire capacity. It's turned out here that the Ukrainians, remember who they are, ex-Soviet and missileers. Remember, most of the missile regiments that went to the Cuba were from Ukraine, by the way. The point being is that in many ways, with enormous inputs being provided by the United States, most in particularly intelligence information, targeting information, is that the Ukrainians are mastering the concept of reconnaissance fires and taking advantage of the technological innovations that we have made over the course of the last 25 years and using it with great effect. Again, aviation plays a very important role here, especially in air defense. And by the way, speaking of air defense, I would mention to you that one weapon system that hasn't been talked about much that might be available in 6 months to 10 months, and that is the MQ-9, which is called the Predator. And a variant of it is designed for maritime surveillance. Also, that radar can be used, if you will, as sort of like a miniature AWACS, an area, in essence, an airborne warning system. It also, we have test flown, and in fact, I might note Mr. Altman's publication discussed this at length, and I recommend that you read The War Zone, which is extraordinarily informative in this regard. We have successfully tested the latest model of the AIM-9X Sidewinder missile with a data link, which allows an unmanned aircraft, if it has the appropriate air-to-air sensor on it, to act as, if you will, both as a surveillance system, air defense surveillance system, specifying looking down for, let's say, low-flying cruise missiles, to be also act as an interceptor platform. And so again, there's some very interesting innovations going on here. And again, I would remind you, go back from a historical perspective, Ukraine is suffering from an air campaign just as London was suffering in 1944 from, guess what? The V1, which was the first generation cruise missile, and the V2, the ballistic missile. And I might like for one final comment. One of the new innovations that's emerged here, which is very challenging for air defenses, and that is long-range ballistic missiles, which have maneuvering reentry vehicles to avoid defenses or to be highly precise. And fortunately for the Ukrainians, the one weapon system, very difficult to shoot down, the SS-26, more or less was wasted in the first phase of the air campaign. They may acquire an analog from the Iranians, or worst case scenario, from the Chinese.
General, you want to weigh in on any of the above?
Yeah, I'll be really short to save some time for some more questions. I think the second question was about unmanned vehicles. I think unmanned vehicles are a misnomer. All of what we're seeing now are remotely piloted aircraft where pilots and men and women are in the loop at some point. And I would say that that, as I mentioned in my remarks, the Ukrainians are using these unmanned drones from the smallest off the shelf up in amazing ways. And yes, they are going to be a big part of any push that Ukraine has in the future. Over.
Yes, I would like to follow up on something that was just mentioned. What do you think the prospects are, and how much would they get if Russia were to purchase short-range ballistic missiles from Iran? And how precise are they actually? And what else does Ukraine need in terms of air defenses to head off this threat? Thank you.
Well, the Iranians are a good example of a country which was highly constrained financially. And it's the old story that if you're broke, maybe you should think. And that is, in this regard, the Iranians have been extremely innovative in developing this full class of both short-range, robotized weapons of one form or another, or developing precision-guided short-range rockets, roughly the analogous to the SS-26. It's the ATACMS. And they have successfully mastered these weapons. And oh, by the way, we were the victim of the bombardment of same in retaliation after Soleimani was assassinated. The airfield in Iraq, fortunately, we had sufficient warning. We suffered no fatalities, although roughly 90 American airmen and other service members suffered overpressure brain damage from these detonations. We are very fortunate we didn't suffer very heavy casualties. That kind of bombardment is available to a whole host of countries that obviously the Chinese have mastered this technology, and that's the kind of weapon they would use on a massive scale. But again, keep in mind, all long-range weapons, especially cruise missiles, Tomahawk class weapons that fly 2,000 kilometers, the modern V1, if you will, or the modern V2, especially if it has ranges well above a few hundred kilometers, are quite expensive to produce. And one of the challenges for a person or a company, a country fighting with these weapons is you may go Winchester, you may shoot these weapons off too quickly, inefficiently. And to some degree, I would argue that's what's happened with the Russians, fortunately for Ukraine.
I think James Shearer has a question for the general.
No, I actually have a question for Peter Wilson.
Oh.
I think it's important. It's not just that I can't resist. I think it's important to engage with your final observation, although it goes beyond the subject of the panel. Equally, I think it is important to understand in addressing that issue that for Vladimir Putin and people of his background, the conviction that the West, the so-called collective West, lacks the will, the cohesion, the tenacity and the courage to wage war with Russia to victory is congenital. There's no rational argument against it. And as a result of that, counterintuitive as it is, to this day, Putin believes that Russia will win this war. Where your question becomes very important is at such time, which we can envisage, when Putin himself believes Russia is losing. And we need to plan for that. In my view, we need to plan for that moment because we will face it.
I'd like to reply to that remark, and that is, I actually think there's an untold story here. This is off the panel subject. You're going to probably cover this later this afternoon. And that is, again, as I like to describe it, as the 800-pound wet gorilla in the wedding tent, which is the subject of nuclear weapons and how it plays out. Remember, for those who said nuclear weapons were useless because they were suicidal or only could cause mass destruction and nothing else, I would argue Vladimir Putin, and this remark was made earlier in our panel discussions, and that is, unfortunately, the presence of nuclear weapons has provided the Russians with an analogous to the American dollar as a reserve currency, an inordinate privilege. And that is, it has allowed the Russians to carry out a protracted, primarily robotized strategic bombardment of Ukraine without fear of large-scale retaliation. And also, as the reference was made, we have been cautious, maybe overly cautious, in willing to escalate the conflict by providing Ukrainians with ever more potent deep strike weapons. Now, I would remind you, the Ukrainians have a substantial military industrial sector. And that, by the way, is another interesting aspect about this war, which is opaque to us in the public. And that is, how well have the Ukrainians, like the Germans or the Vietnamese, adapted to the air campaign and now are in a position to help in the production of subsystems or components, or in the transition. Again, I go back to planning. I think now we have to think in terms about how Ukraine's military industrial sector goes through a reform process that they were contemplating roughly the summer before the invasion, to become much more integrated in a long-term defense strategy to deal with a Russia which probably, even post-Putin, will have features of Putinism.
For the general.
Yeah.
Waller?
Yeah, I'd like to turn the attention to something General Breedlove said last year in a kind of prescient situation where both he and Hodges, General Hodges, had thought that things were going to go a lot better than everybody else was predicting. You, sir, and Ambassador Volker, who's going to be here this afternoon, made a very good point about in terms of some of the aircraft that were available. I know Mr. Wilson has given us a kind of more pessimistic view of things, but I remember 3 years ago, we at the security dialogue, we suggested that Ukrainians are some of the best pilots, have some of the best pilots in all Eastern Europe. They're equivalent to Poland and to Romania. Now,
That's not the issue.
No, but there was a second issue, and this is the one that I'm going to bring up. You also mentioned an excellent plane called the A-10. And I'm actually angry because the A-10 could have been very useful. I was in Irpin in Bucha, and I saw the highway of death. And I can't understand if, I think General Breedlove had mentioned that we had 8 or 10 Ukrainian pilots that actually had skills in that. Why didn't we get supplied with something like our beautiful flying tank, given the fact that it could have been given by even non-NATO countries who had it?
I have an answer.
I actually would like the
Yeah,
general,
let's
and
let
then
the general get it first.
So initially, I would just answer that it's like all the other what have been called offensive capabilities. It's all about policy. Our administration, not being political here, but being factual, has said no to almost everything, starting with the Javelin to the Stingers to the Patriots, which are yet to be there, to the tanks, which are yet to be there, to the small diameter bombs, which are yet to be there. We said no because this seemed to be a red line for Mr. Putin. And more than anything else, I believe we are nearly completely deterred in giving Ukraine the capabilities that we believe Mr. Putin thinks would be offensive. Once, and as you rightly put out, and when all of the tank army was mired in the mud north of Kyiv, a very small group of capable A-10s would have made a difference to this entire war, because we're fighting all those tanks now in the east after they escaped back into Belarus, Russia, and were refit, refurbed, and sent into the fight. So I think that the Army has a term which I love to use called shooting behind the target. And we are consistently shooting behind the target with our policy. And if we had been shooting in front of the target at that time, I think this war would be very different now, because Russia's army would have been defeated very quickly in that mud.
About the F-16, again, as pointed out, the A-10, I agree with you. My understanding, though, is that the Ukrainian Air Force said no to the A-10 because, quote unquote, it's not a supersonic fighter bomber. And also they made a judgment early on, because of their own experience, that that manned aircraft was not going to survive the dense air defenses of the Russians, as they're not surviving the relatively dense air defenses of Ukraine. Because that's one of the interesting things about this. Remember, most people, again, short-term memory, remember Aleppo and how the Russians treated Aleppo with Tu-22s dropping iron bombs, just like World War II or the Korean War or the Vietnam War. You haven't, with a brief moment in Mariupol, where they were used in the siege of the ironworks, they have not been able to carry out a terror campaign like Aleppo using their air power, because rest assured, even the current and now rapidly modernizing air defense system of the Ukrainians, that would be a suicide mission for the Russian long-range aviation, and they're not going to do it. So they've used their platforms as standoff launching platforms, bomb trucks. They're big Tu-95 turboprop bombers, etc. Have all been launching long-range strike weapons, and we know that the production and quantity of those weapons are finite, and that they've had to have. And we also have learned one of the great, I would say, insights. We did not fully realize how much the Russian aerospace and defense industry had been globalized and had lost its own indigenous manufacturing capacity to produce microprocessors, much less, ladies and gentlemen, machine tools. Most people are unaware of the fact the Russian military industrial sector, both civilian and military, is incredibly dependent upon the importation of resources from the West, because for all the talk of the third Rome, the third superpower, Vladimir and company talked the talk, but didn't walk the walk in this regard.
We're down to the last three questions.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
I'd like to address a couple of points. One that General Breedlove raised in the context of the policy created sanctuaries, and get back to the point that Dr. Scher made earlier about the mindset of Putin and the games that we're playing. I think we're more in a poker game than a chess game in dealing with the Russians in terms of calling each other's bluffs. And certainly Putin has been bluffing us for some time. Ukrainians are beginning to call that bluff with the bombings in Belgorod, the bombings in Crimea. They're testing all that regularly now. So we know that the red lines that Putin is tossing out there are movable objects. In that context, I'd like to turn to the air power and F-16s. Why aren't we training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s? We may not deliver any planes for 18 months. Hell, we agreed on Abrams tanks. They're not going to see them for 18 months. But what is the message to Putin? We're willing to stand with Ukraine in serious ways to increase their capacity to take on the Russians so that they start thinking second times and third times about their strategies vis-a-vis Ukraine. They're right now dictating the tempo of the war as an attrition war in Donbass. Lots of artillery. You're reading in the US press now regularly about the war of attrition, how it's to the advantage of the Russians, and they're playing on our psychology. We've got to turn that around. If we start giving Ukraine capability, whether or not it's in 6 weeks, 6 months, or 18 months is irrelevant. We're sending a message that we're going to get serious about this and increase Ukraine's capabilities to counterattack, to regain territory and strategic objectives like Crimea. So why can't we do that? That's far short of delivering a weapon system, and yet it gives them the opportunity to rethink their strategy. Why can't we do that?
Well, I mean, I would argue again, I have, from my point of view, I was hoping that we would start training Ukrainian pilots last summer. And as an earlier comment was, I always thought it made sense that the first tranche should be brought in with A-10s to act as a bomb truck and with providing the A-10s with standoff launch capability if to support the Ukrainian front into both the tactical and operational sense. That hasn't happened. I would agree with you that we should, for political symbolic reasons, do this with the understanding that we are providing the Ukrainians with the capacity to defeat the Russian army this summer, well before this military capability that is in the form of a squadron or two of F-16s, and that's what we're talking about initially, which is not positive in the sense of the outcome of the war. The war, I would argue, it could well be ended before those aircraft are fully operational. But be as it may, yes, for political symbolic reasons, I don't have a quarrel with your argument. But again, I would argue, as a practical matter, we have to look in terms of what can be provided. I mean, like the battle tank story is quite interesting to me. It's a very interesting example of politics in the highest order. And that is the M1s are cover for Olaf Scholz to make the commitment to because only the Leopard 2s and Leopard 1s, by the way, which are in large quantities sitting in various shape, is a very adequate main battle tank, could be provided to the Ukrainians this spring in large numbers. So again, some of this is maintaining alliance solidarity. No one gets too ahead of their skis, blah, blah, blah. But it again is a question of a coalition strategy, which I would argue the Biden administration has performed surprisingly well. Remember the earlier comments about political support in this country. The opposition to Ukraine right now is primarily on the Republican extreme right, which articulates a form of new isolationism as part of its ideology. At the moment, it's hardly a dominant force, but it certainly gets a powerful megaphone. And again, outsiders may choose to overinterpret what this does or does not mean. Obviously, over time, as the war drags on, there will be more and more calls saying this is an expensive and ineffective enterprise.
Okay. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, Peter Wilson mentioned that it would be a very good idea for Ukraine to get a hold of existing Warsaw Pact planes, old Soviet models that are still usable. I've read that there are at least 77 of these in the former Warsaw Pact countries, yet no effort seems to be being made to bring them to Ukraine and bring them into fighting condition and modify them along the lines Mr. Wilson suggested. Do either of you have any suggestions as to why this is happening and what can be done to accelerate their delivery and modification?
General?
I said it before. I know I sound like a broken record. We are deterred. Our current leadership is not enamored with anything that feels offensive, and aircraft feel offensive. I think it's that simple. Over.
I don't have an argument, General Breedlove. The short answer is I don't know. That seems to be the plausible explanation.
Last question.
One of the interesting things of this conflict has been highlighted by papers by Greco and Bremer, Colonel Bremer, and that is that we are seeing a situation where defense is dominant in the air. Neither side pushes manned aircraft in the other side's airspace. They say this is a continuing problem because it's the mobile anti-air systems that are causing the damage, and we have shown very little ability to hunt and kill mobile missile systems. I'd like to hear the panelists' view on, will this be a continuing thing, or is that something that can be solved?
I would tell you that that's exactly what I was talking about in my remarks about bad lessons learned. We're looking at two air forces that are performing now. I think the Ukrainian Air Force is performing way above its station and doing a great job. But I think the Russian Air Force is performing way, let me say it one more time, like my son, way below expectations for theirs. I have watched our Western air power in the past disassemble integrated air defenses, and I would not draw any conclusions about what integrated air defenses are doing in this war based on the performance of the Russian Air Force. Over.
I would be a little more forward leaning and suggest that we should take the prospect that we're watching a major transformation that's underway. And then the question is, where are we in the conduct of war in this regard?
I want to thank our panelists for very excellent presentations. We're all better informed, and I trust we'll find ways to use this knowledge as we all enter into what will certainly be spirited debates over the next weeks. Thank you.
Herman, General, Mr. Wilson, it was a delight to have you. I know that General Kremnetsky was called away to the Pentagon. There may be something happening at this very moment, so he wasn't able to be with us. But the good news is he's been talking with General Milley about one thing or another in terms of air power. So maybe there is something going on at this very moment. Our next dialogue is as interesting as the first two, because it's assessing Ukraine's maritime and coastal defense capabilities and needs. It will be moderated by someone who I've come to deeply respect in exactly this field, and that is my friend Glen Howard, president of the Jamestown Foundation. He will be running it, and I'm inviting Admiral Kabanenko. I think Miss Jill Sinclair will be connecting from Canada, yes. And Dr. Stephen Blank, who you've heard from before. And so, Glenn. This is a good crowd, and this is a very interesting subject, because I think something in sea power is beginning. Hello, comrade. You can talk about what you want. The best thing that you talk about is status of the state of the word. You don't have to talk about it. You talk about maritime, that's fine. So yeah. What when I have to think about very Першій годині. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson, if you can stay around for the press con, with the press, or you're going to stay with us, right? Right.
And then unfortunately, I don't think I can stay that evening. My sold in my house.
Right. I got it. I got it. All right.
Yeah, there's lipstick on that.
I was wearing it last night.
I'd like to call everybody to order so that we can stay on time. But I do want to say a word about Glenn, the individual who's going to be running this. Glenn has become a very close friend, and I must say that he runs a little chat room that is probably one of the most interesting chat rooms available. Some of you may get our memos. The larger group gets memos, and a lot of it has to do with edited versions of what Glenn and his group discuss. And a lot of those people that you're seeing here today are in fact part of that discussion. It's an interesting group, and Glenn himself has been talking about sea power and the Ukrainian capabilities or lack of capabilities for a long, long time. He was there at the very beginning of all this, he and his good friend, Admiral Kabanenko. And as you know, when it comes to Dr. Blank has been talking about watch Crimea before Crimea was taken by the Russians. So this is a very good group. And Miss Sinclair from Canada, actually, she had asked not only about this, but about the larger issues. She's as good as, she's a former deputy defense minister. And so it's a very good group. Glenn, it's all yours. Okay.
Okay. I assume you can hear me. Am I on? Okay, I am. All right. I'm Glen Howard, president of the Jamestown Foundation, and I'm delighted to be able to chair this magnificent panel assessing Ukraine's maritime needs. And we have a great lineup, and I'm very delighted to be kind of moderating this today and providing my input, something I've been very passionate about. Although the state of the war from the maritime perspective kind of diminished after the sinking of the Moskva. So among other things, but I think there's also in Crimea, during the Crimea War, there were a lot of things that happened in terms of revolutionary military technology changes. I think inside the current state of the war in the Black Sea, there's been some revolutionary changes made. One is the kind of development and fielding of the Neptune. That went from a process of non-existence and many hundreds of failed launches to one of it finally worked, and they hit the jackpot when they hit the Moskva. And now Ukraine has sea denial capabilities with the naval strike missiles that they've now received and the harpoons they've received from the United States and its NATO allies. So that and the uncrewed submerged vehicle attacks that happened in September on the port of the Russian naval base of Sevastopol, again, has images of the Monitor and Merrimack to me in terms of steaming out and Hampton Roads of the major changes that occurred with these attacks using the uncrewed submerged vehicles. And now you see the Russians trying to replicate that with its attack a couple of weeks ago on the Zatoka Bridge that brings all the grain through Ukrainian Bessarabia from Romania to Ukraine. They tried to attack the bridge. So there's some revolutionary things happening in terms of the maritime dimensions in the Black Sea that I would say not so much of sea control, but more of sea denial capabilities by Ukraine. But we'll get into this discussion and I'll weigh in and provide comments as we go along. First speaker is Ihor Kabanenko, who's a prolific writer. I like to refer to him as the Ukrainian version of Stavridis. He's a retired admiral with a very powerful pen. And someone has educated me about numerous things related to Ukrainian security. Great admirer of his work. You can find some of his writings on the Jamestown Foundation website. He has worked many various positions within the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Actually served on a Corvette during the Cold War, so he's got a lot of experience there. But currently, he's president of UARPA, Ukrainian Advanced Research Project Agency, which focuses on high-tech solutions and products for defense. So he'll be carrying and presenting his part of sharing his views on the aspects of the maritime dimension. Our next speaker is the one and only. After that will be Jill Sinclair, who's Executive Director, External Engagement Partnerships at the Canadian Defense Academy at the Department of National Defense, where she was previously Assistant Deputy Minister from 2008 to 2014. So Jill has a very long career and understanding of Ukraine and helping Ukraine. So we're very much interested in hearing what she will have to say. Last but not least, batting cleanup is the one and only Steve Blank. So no need to introduce Steve to you. He is always wields a very powerful pen and very vocal in terms of his views and expressions of knowledge of grand strategy. So he's currently Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And prior to that, he was Senior Fellow on Russia at the American Foreign Policy Council. And before that at the Army War College. And someone who's been around the block and knows Russian military affairs inside and out for many, many decades. So on that note, I will turn the floor over to Admiral Kabanenko. So Ihor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Glenn. Good morning, everybody. First of all, let me express my sincere gratitude to organizers of this important conference for the invitation to be a speaker here. Given the topic of our panel, I will touch on some of the key, from my perspective, lessons, what should be learned, lessons of the year of the war at sea, and the related capability needs. Let me start with the doctrinal aspect. Along what impact from sea to coast of different naval means dominated in pre-war naval warfare doctrines. According to this, Russia had and still have naval power supremacy compared to Ukraine. Taking this into consideration, it was low chance for Ukraine to survive at the war at sea launched by Moscow. But then our Navy made a bet on the coastal defense capabilities. And in the beginning, it was naval mines and coastal artillery, and then anti-ship missiles and drones. Russian plans for sea control and sea denial over Ukraine's littoral waters collapsed. Due to this, the Moscow cruiser, it was already mentioned, as well as a number of other Russian warships and combat boats were destroyed or seriously damaged, which ultimately caused Russian warships withdrawal out of our anti-ship missile range. So Ukraine's rely on impact from coast to sea looks very smart, well fitted with close sea geography. What we should learn from this lesson concerning naval warfare in close sea? Firstly, the right balance of sea-based and coast-based naval capabilities is needed. And secondly, coastal anti-ship missile capabilities are an effective tool of sea control and sea denial as far from coastline as missile range allows to do so. The second lesson is about the rapid adaptation of advanced technologies to military purposes, what leads to data and precise strike tactical superiority. In turn, it brings cost effectiveness in maritime and riverine operations, including effective impact to the enemy and well-resulted rates of higher maneuverable assets. The year of this war shows the intensive use of unmanned vehicles. In fact, drones have changed not only tactics, but warfare nature forever. Various unmanned vehicles integrated by special software with computers and satellite radio systems into different automated combat systems already allow to provide maritime domain awareness and hunt for enemies' warships and combat crafts. In this regard, let me remind sea drones attack against Russian warships in the Sevastopol Bay on October 29th. last year. Also, it was mentioned already, high efficiency in gravitation to systems with autonomous functions they demonstrate is becoming an increasingly important factor in air and maritime supremacy, previously reserved for manned assets. Competition in this sphere is increasing only, and we should not give the enemy any chance to win this competition. I think it is critically important for us. In this regard, I applaud the decision has been made by our state leadership in terms of allocation $500 million in 2023 fiscal year for Ukraine's military unmanned capabilities support, creation and development. In the third lesson, I would touch on the riverine warfare. Somebody thinks what riverine operational access plays exclusively supplementary role of ground battlefields, synchronized with land forces movement. I do not think so categorically based on the this war experience. Let's look on in the Dnipro Delta. It has a many miles narrow sleeves between riverine islands, is connected with the Dnipro estuary, the Achakev Sea River node and Kimburn Spit are located. This is an important operational area where there is no heavy ground combat now, but is ongoing struggle for riverine domination aimed to. For Russians, bridgehead creation for food, assault operations, amphibious, saboteurs, etc. on right bank of Dnipro and left bank of the southern Bug rivers. For us, an access getting into Russian troops' western flank on the Dnipro River left bank, exiting to Crimea isthmuses and blocking Russian Marines landing to the right bank of the southern Bug. Sorry for my operational details, but in the end, in the details, it is details that matters to success. So the operational situation development in the riverine axis is decisive. It will turn further ground forces activity on one or another direction. Thanks to the US and UK military technical assistance, our Navy already deployed several naval utility helicopters and small fast crafts in riverine operational areas. It would be wrong to believe that Russians do not learn the war lessons. Serious conclusions in a number of tactical miscalculations have been made by them, including maritime and riverine operations, naval aviation use tactics of small amphibious groups, etc. This war reminds us what Russians are masters of maskirovka, deceit, and cunning. But in general, Moscow's military strategic culture is still a hostage to the former Soviet conception of warfare that means massive use of Russian means of war, first of all, manpower. This is due to a number of historical, political, and cultural factors, as well as the technological backwardness of Russian main weapon system. The loss of manpower is considered by the Kremlin not as important as achieving the political military goal. We can see what the Kremlin fuels the so-called self-sacrifice of Russian militaries for so-called Great Russia in a very possible way. So this lesson learned us what Moscow will continue attempts to break through our defense, the UMAS-style operations in different domains. This lesson also turned a higher consumption of ammunition. Total number of shells shot by aggressor daily achieved 25,000. For comparison, the Ukraine used 7, 10, maximum 12,000 shells per day, so 2-3 times less than Russians. Thanks to the US caliber shells, HIMARS, and other systems, Ukraine already has capabilities for higher accuracy strikes that allow precisely Russian military assets and its logistic supply in tactical depth. But protracted war by and large, whereas the main question is not only who possesses the silver, shell, let's say, They are very important, but also who has more shells. From my perspective, last Ramstein meeting reasonably touched on this issue. My last but not the least lesson is summarizing above, and it is about asymmetry at sea and related needs. The reality has shown what Russian mass-style operations at sea are weak in the face of our strategic asymmetry due to it's a non-linear approach, the introduction of advanced defense technologies, higher motivation, and better training of Ukrainian military personnel. Understanding the impact of asymmetry at sea leads us to conclusion that naval mosquito capabilities development is a warfare game changing at sea. What does mosquito mean? This means small, fast, high maneuverable with low signature tools of warfare. At the same time, capable effectively impact to the larger enemy. So my 5 priority list of Ukraine's naval capabilities looks the next. More coastal anti-ship missile batteries, small size missiles like Hellfire Longbow or the same for dozens mosquito platforms, pickups, helicopters and boats, more fast boats, fast crafts and maritime aviation. Someone may argue that something more traditional has higher priority rate for current maritime and riverine, for current operations in maritime and riverine domain. But dynamics of changes is evidencing what the new reality is coming, and this reality eliminates returning back to the pre-war life. This does not mean that the new reality will be worse, but definitely be different. What exactly will it be different depends, what exactly will it be? Depends on our understanding of geopolitical changes, non-traditional out-of-the-box strategic thinking, innovative approach, as well as our extraordinary energy to implement such a strategy. I am convinced what not a fear of the war escalation, as well as looking back, but the strategic asymmetry in different levels, including the ability to take risks, not avoid them, based on tendencies understanding, argued decisiveness and win-centric preemption of our joint efforts will lead us to the wished victory of the Kremlin tyranny. Let me end on this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent overview, Ihor. That's a great discussion and lots of things to think about. I think especially your comments about the importance of riverine warfare on the Dnieper. Our next speaker is Jill. So Jill, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Glenn, very much. And thanks to Walter and to everybody for this amazing session. And I'm sorry that I couldn't be there with my panelists. Look, I'm totally not an expert on maritime affairs, and I told Walter that. But I'm really happy to play into this panel because I think a lot of the themes that we've been hearing, throughout the morning, and certainly my comments can be shortened a lot because Admiral, you've talked about a lot of the things I was going to touch on. I wanted to look at this more through my lens as working, with Ukraine on the Defense Reform Advisory Board over time, and just seeing the evolution of sort of strategic thinking, preparation, approaches to things. But I was going to start off by saying that the key here is to think about Ukraine as a maritime nation and as a riparian nation. And I often, have found, even in my discussions, pre-war, that we kind of forgot about the intricacy of the river systems, the importance where all the critical infrastructure sits, where major, industrial sites are, and that we tend to be a little bit linear. So again, the Admiral's words and those of previous speakers about needing to be non-linear about how we think about this. And I think the maritime piece fits in this completely because the Ukrainian Navy is a strategic asymmetric capability. And I don't think that we've, yet seen it fully utilized in that way. And I'm not sure that Ukraine's partners have focused on how to help them utilize it that way. And it's an asymmetric capability because it builds uncertainty for the Russian Navy. And again, I'm so humbled to be with experts on this panel who actually know what they're talking about in this area. But I was just noting that recently the commander of the Ukrainian Navy, said that today 25,000 square kilometers of the Ukrainian Black Sea is a gray zone where Russian ships do not enter, fearing destruction. And I think this comes back to a point that Ben Hodges and others made, and that is that, introducing uncertainty and risk calculation and making situations possibly untenable for the Russians is extremely important. And that's because the effectiveness of what Ukraine has done with all of that agility and that innovation and developing the Neptune and everything that we've seen in sort of the maritime domain. But I think it's extremely important, this asymmetry and playing. We've talked a lot about Russian psychology this morning too, playing with Russian minds around this to bring that same uncertainty into the maritime, and I would suggest the riparian domains that they feel in other areas too, just because Ukraine is agile and creative and does extraordinary things with what we give her to fight. At the moment, we know about the ports. We know Ukraine only, controls 20% of its coastline, and the Navy, doesn't feel like it's been a priority to date because most of the fight has been land warfare. But I'm also sort of taking our theme of today, which is sort of, after a year of war, and I'd like to actually change that to what we've talked about again earlier this morning. That's looking towards victory. And so, how do we position Ukraine not just to secure that victory, but to secure and hold liberated territories? And when you get into that, then the riparian kind of dimension of this becomes extremely, extremely important. Again, the admiral's gone through his wish list, and so I'm not going to add to that because it was very, very comprehensive. One thing that I know in speaking to folks before, during, and recently, amphibious capability is something that keeps coming back. I'd actually like to ask my own panelist colleagues here what they feel about this. But to control coastline and rivers, we need, Ukraine needs to have that amphibious capability, and after liberation to ensure control and deterrence effect to maintain sovereignty of Ukrainian territory. I also was going to talk a lot about the Dnipro, but again, the admiral has done this. It's no secret that, Ukraine can be cut in two by that river. And so it's extremely important to make sure that there is this robust, river presence and capability and war and in peace. And I think my last point would be about for victory and peace and to hold Ukrainian territory and to defend. It's not too soon now to be working on these important elements of doctrine, of the legislation that's required to get to a total defense kind of approach. There was, again, a lot of talk about sort of combined arms, but a total defense approach which really integrates all the capabilities to ensure Ukraine's defense and its security. And so things that are going on today, even things like the revision of the law on national security, which a lot of us are following, and some probably in the room and remotely are too. Extremely important to get these pieces on C2 and the separation of things like forced generation and forced employment, and to get kind of as I say, the command and control stuff settled properly in the legislation so that Ukraine is positioned, with the capability, with the kit, with the doctrine, with the training, but also with the legislative framework and the certainty and the budget stuff that comes out of that, and the ability to have the dialogue with partners in order to have this total defense approach going forward that integrates Ukraine as a maritime nation that looks to the Black Sea, of course, and we've already talked about the importance of Crimea, but also of its river systems. And with that, I'll hand back to you. Over.
Thank you very much. I think your point about the Dnieper being a dividing line is a really important one, and I think that the amphibious capabilities dimension is really interesting, and that's something I'll circle back to ask in the Q&A Ihor about, because he's been very adamant about that. So last but not least is our last in batting cleanup is Steve Blank. Steve. It's on.
Okay. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Walter, for inviting me to this distinguished panel. It's a pleasure to speak to you again. I'm going to be talking about something that is understudied, the maritime dimension of the war, specifically Russian operations. Most everything you read is about land and air operations, particularly land. However, I think the maritime dimension has been unjustly neglected, and there are profoundly important lessons and events happening here. I intend to say a few words to open about the nature of that dimension, and then get into the Russian operations, and then conclude with ideas like many of my previous speakers, how to help Ukraine win in this dimension, which I think would open up multiple strategic possibilities. We're also going to discuss, because of this, the nuclear dimension. Peter Wilson mentioned that it was necessary to talk about it. It's not on the program, but it is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and we need to address it. And it's important, as you'll see, in the maritime dimension of the war. First of all, the Black Sea is not the only theater of maritime importance in this war. Now, the Black Sea's importance is paramount. We all agree to that. I think everybody studying the war understands it's not only a war for Ukraine's survival. This is a war against the West. And its a target is European security as such, if not international security. Russian spokesman, Kabanenko, the entire European security order is illegitimate. Well, if it's illegitimate, what is to replace it? Essentially, the law of the jungle. Another Russian commentator said what we have done is a preemptive strike against Europe. Now, if Russia were to win, as Zbigniew Brzezinski reminded us, it would become an empire again, having you suborned Ukraine, and it would be a threat to all the rest of Europe. As a matter of fact, if you take into account the revelations of last week in Moldova about the coup, the demonstrations in Belgrade, orchestrated by Wagner. I have an article coming out in the Monitor about that. Then you see what this is all about. And the Black Sea figures prominently in Russia's international strategy as well as in its domestic security. My colleagues have talked about the River Rhine dimension of the war. I'm not going to repeat what they have to say, but it is essential that we understand that this is a war about the control and use of the Black Sea. And for Russia, it is important that the Black Sea not just be a highway for Russian commerce, which is fine normally in peacetime, but it is also a highway by which Russia projects power into the Mediterranean. I have an article coming about in the Indian Ocean, and even as far as Africa. To see the importance of Africa to Russia right now, all you have to do is see Mr. Lavrov's travel itinerary. I have another article coming out that's titled Sergei Lavrov, the African Explorer. If you, you got it. Okay. It came to me as I was writing this. Actually, so I'm going to introduce a little levity into the proceedings, because what we have to say here is really very serious. The Black Sea is not, however, the only aspect of this war. Whatever you know about Russian maritime strategy and operations during the war omits the fact that in the weeks leading up to this war, Russia conducted a series of exercises where it surged the Northern Fleet and accompanying air capabilities, and the Mediterranean squadron, escadra in Russian, and other capabilities, in order to threaten NATO with dual-use nuclear-capable platforms. It also cut the Svalsat telecommunications network linking the Northern Europe with the United States. It also conducted a series of deployments, not only in the Irish Sea, if you remember the scandal of Irish fishermen, but also against the United States. In other words, Russian strategy here, even if it was just cooked up by Putin and 3 or 4 guys in his office, aimed at deterring Europe from the outset. And therefore, there's a nuclear dimension to all of this, as has been hinted. Second, the initial missions of the Russian Navy in this operation are 4. One, we talked about deterring NATO. That was implicit. It's not stated anywhere in the taskings, but explicitly the 3 missions the Navy was given blockade of Ukraine, conjunction with the army to carry out amphibious landings all along the coastline, so that as it was believed the army would advance towards Odessa, they would carry out these operations in Mariupol, which they did, and then Kherson, Odessa, and so on. Third, to carry out missile strikes against Ukrainian targets. This is a standard part of Russian naval doctrine, strategic operations to attack critical infrastructure targets, SODSIT in English. You can see the 2017 naval doctrine. It's there, and that was still the operating doctrine, although they came out with a new one since then. The blockade continues. As a matter of fact, the grain agreement that was laboriously negotiated last summer is in danger of going away because its time is up very soon, and there's no sign that Russia is going to accept an extension. So we could have, again, the Black Sea becoming a platform for international blockade of food. The North Sea also, the amphibious landings. Amphibious landings failed because the Russian army failed. Furthermore, the Russian navies failed as well. Alexander Goltz reports that the Russian government failed to organize a coherent command structure at the beginning of the war. This is important in understanding why the Navy could not perform, but it is also important to understand that the Navy itself suffers from a grave lack of seamanship. We saw this with the Moskva and other ships also. So when the Ukrainian Navy started attacking Russian ships, they have sunk to date 18 ships. The Russian Navy decamped to friendly ports and sits there. But nevertheless, the blockade continues. So it is necessary to break the blockade. I believe here as well that the Ukrainian Navy must get the kinds of reinforcements Admiral Kabanenko talked about, as well as the air capabilities to do maritime reconnaissance and strike that was discussed in the last panel, because to me, as General Hodges said, it is essential to overturn the strategic equation by taking Crimea out of the equation for Russia. As I said in my question, the Crimean operation, if it works, will make the Russian position in Donbass unsustainable, free up enormous economic resources for Ukraine, break the blockade for the world so that grain gets through. It will also deprive Russia of the means of using its energy and military capabilities to threaten the entire Balkan states as part of its strategy. And the Balkan here is what I intend to argue in a forthcoming paper, is the second front for Russia in this war in order to destabilize Europe and also to reassert its energy and military primacy throughout Southeastern Europe and the Black Sea. Furthermore, psychologically, this will unnerve the Russian government and military. I do not think that the nuclear weapon will be used, although all these threats must be taken seriously. The U.S. government has reported that it takes these threats credibly. Nevertheless, it is clear that we have been able to retaliate to Russian escalation and do things the Russians have said were the red line without NATO itself being attacked. Furthermore, it is very clear that if Russia were to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, it would undermine its own military capabilities. The Soviets learned 50 years ago that nuclear weapons in Europe prevent the Soviet army from invading and moving forward. The same would be true for the Russian army in Ukraine. And this is not the Soviet army by any stretch of the imagination, as we can see. So the Russian naval operations have failed due to a lack of seamanship, poor strategic thinking in Moscow, which we now know to have been endemic throughout the war, and to the agility and bravery and capabilities of the Ukraine, backed up by Western support. In conclusion, though, that support has to continue and be ramped up. The fact is, the Abrams tanks will not be delivered until 2024, if they were ever intended to be delivered. The $64 billion that were promised to Ukraine last year, only half of it has been delivered. We could look at similar instances down the road, and we've talked about it extensively here, as to the failure to deliver in a timely fashion the equipment that Ukraine needs. I would argue that one of the reasons we have not seen the Ukrainian offensive since September is because of too much dithering in European and American capitals over what weapons to give them, which allowed the Russian army to get back in the game, to reconstitute itself, to strengthen its defenses, and to carry out its strike operations that are trying to decimate the Ukrainian economy and public support, and which are going to continue until Russia is defeated. And defeating them in the Crimea takes out major platforms for these missile strikes. So let me conclude by saying that we have to understand that the maritime war here is not confined to the Black Sea. It is an attack not only on Black Sea littoral states like Ukraine, but the naval dimensions of this war represent a standing threat to Europe and North America, because in those surges, they surged weapons that have a dual capability that could attack the United States and Canada. So we are not immune from the threat. And with that kind of understanding in mind, it is therefore necessary to brace ourselves to our tasks and get on with the real mission here, which is to win the war in the most expeditious and rapid way possible, to prevent further slaughter and to secure the Europe that was established in the wake of the end of the Cold War. To conclude, Russia has broken 8 treaties with Ukraine. Anybody who thinks that a negotiated agreement with Ukraine would therefore be valid is definitely not paying attention to either history or strategy. And what we need is both more learning of history and more strategy. Thank you.
Okay, now, since the title of this panel is on assessment, Ihor, in our conversations in the last day, you have brought something very interesting about the importance of the Dnieper and Mykolaiv and what these Russian sabotage groups that are working up and down the Dnieper are trying to accomplish. All right, Dnieper. Yes. So can we, you said this is very important. It's still a key element of Russian strategy. So can you just walk us through what you meant by that and what, why there's still a danger to Odessa working through this, through the riverine aspects of this?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question. So yeah, it's some kind of return back to amphibious operation, Russian amphibious operation, but on riverine domain. Right now they are trying to, because now exists a so-called gray zone in the Dnieper Delta. There's a lot of sleeves, river sleeves exist, and a lot of islands are there. And they try to move in this direction based on, again, based on mosquito capabilities. They own
the Russians are.
Yeah, Russians are.
So the Russians are using mosquito.
Yeah, they assist from from Ukraine, civilian, different structures and people, and of course bring their own in this area. And of course they try. It looks like a gripping, annexation this area. They just launched the land there, small South reconnaissance special operations saboteurs groups, and of course why it's dangerous, because it's a possibility to land them in already. They are doing this to land them on right bank in this area, on right bank of Dnieper River, as well as to get access to coastal areas, sandy beaches in the Ochakov area. It's right bank of Southern Bug River. So in this situation, if they will first of all, right now it's a combat to get domination between Ukraine and Russia to achieve supremacy in this area. We can imagine if Russia will achieve that, so we will get opportunity to land their forces not only in this area, what I mentioned before, in the western part of Kherson, It would be nearer to a suburb of Mykolaiv. There are a lot of forests, so in summertime it's some advantages they can get there, but also the opportunity to land the amphibious, assault groups, different forces on the right bank of the sandy beaches near Ochakov, and cut off this road highway between Mykolaiv and Odessa, and of course to move to the western part of Mykolaiv. So in some operational situation, some conditions can be created to close Mykolaiv from three parts, from south, western and eastern part. So of course with support of land forces. So in this regard, what they are doing right now, it evidence what they have plans in this area, because Mykolaiv for them, it's not only access to shipbuilding facilities, huge shipbuilding facilities. It's not possible for Russia to develop their, aircraft carriers and big ships without possessing of such facilities. This is why they have a goal to occupy Mykolaiv, but also this is access to Odessa. And after that, this is why I recommend to pay attention not only this area, the Dnipro Delta, Charkiv, Sivi River North, and Kimburg speed, but also to southern Bessarabia. And this is why they just several times they tried to destroy this bridge, the Zatoka Bridge. And after renovation by Ukraine, they again and again they strike. And they sent last time, as you mentioned, they sent this Russian sea drone to destroy again this. And of course, this is also matters for Russia because it's access to Transnistria, to Moldova, and of course, it's access for western suburb to Odessa. So it looks like elements of for the Russian maritime strategy in this area. And I think what our coastal defense capabilities, mosquito, let's say, capabilities, asymmetry will play this critically important role for us to not allow to implement such a plans.
Okay.
And also just one, let me also say one point. What I recommend to pay attention because this is Delta, the Dnipro Delta area. It's very similar to Danube Delta because a lot of islands are there. And keeping in mind Putin's statement in terms of Moldova, I would recommend to pay special attention to this riverine area and in the context of the same activities there in Danube. I mean in the Danube Delta. Thank you.
We have someone fervently waving their hand in the back of the room. I believe that's Peter Wilson, if my eyes are treating me right. And I'm going to come back to you, to Jill. I'm going to ask you a question once this gentleman asks his question about Canadian. What are Canadian priorities right now in terms of with Ukraine? What, if you could possibly share that with us, sir?
The question I have to the panel is, I'd be interested in your appreciation of the relationship now and for the near future between Ukraine and Turkey, which has a complex relationship, as you all well know. And as I understand it, the Turks are building a number of corvettes for Ukraine, and that naturally Sultan Erdogan is shall we say, playing a very interesting double game in this regard, but I'd be interested in your comments of whether this can ultimately be a more fruitful relationship from the Ukrainian point of view.
Let me start. As you said, Erdogan's playing both sides against the middle. Turkey is building corvettes for Ukraine, and they also are building a factory with Ukraine. I believe it's in Ukraine to produce those Bayraktar drones, which have been,
and the Kinji. They're building the Kinji long-range drone
Okay.
bomber.
All right. So those have been devastatingly effective weapons. But on the other hand, they're playing with Russia. They still get 50 to 60% of their gas through Turk Stream, which is a Russian pipeline. They are in this cooperative but competitive relationship with Russia in the Caucasus and in Syria, which would take too long to get into explanation, but which is well known. And they are conducting what is essentially an independent policy at the same time as they are relying upon NATO to protect them from Moscow dominating the Black Sea or even attacking them, and standing on their rights under the Montreux Treaty to close the Black Sea in time of war. And if you know anything about Turkish politics, they believe the Montreux Treaty was created on the 5th day of creation by God and is an eternal law that, you know, and governs Turkey's politics. So there's unless something dramatic happens in the election, which is soon, I don't see that the Turks are going to abandon this quasi playing of both sides against the middle, and the effort to posture Turkey as an independent major power, at least in the region, to get the benefits from both sides and minimize the risks of dealing with the Russians.
And I would comment too that Turkish cluster munitions have been playing a very devastating role on Russian infantry in Donbass and Bakhmut. And not only that, but Ukrainians have given briefings to the Pentagon about the innovative uses of the cluster munitions that Turkey's provided. When the US has major stockpiles of cluster munitions, which we are not giving to Ukraine. So you can talk about Sultan Erdogan, but as long as the straits are cut off, the Russian Navy cannot get any more major class cruisers or warships into the Black Sea. So they've basically kneecapped the Russians. I mean, you can, whatever way you want to look at it, they can't get stuff in. So, and this is now entering the 2nd year of the war. So, and we still can. I mean, we've got air power. So Jill, I promised you I would come back to you. So do you want to comment?
Just a couple of words.
Oh,
Yeah.
Ihor wants to. All right.
Yeah, please.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, from my perspective, yeah, Ukrainian, Turkish relations has a very good dynamics in different sphere, political, economical, military cooperation, as it was mentioned just previously. In terms of corvettes, they look symmetrical assets, but symmetrically, from my perspective, it would be very difficult to win the war with Russian, big ship, battle with big ships, Russian big ships. So again and again, we need some kind of unusual, non-linear, asymmetrical, approaches to, first of all, to impact effectively to the enemy, but avoid the enemy response or enemy strikes, because they have a lot of such capabilities. So probably these assets would be good fit with post-war, activities. I don't know, but it's a question that arises in terms of such a priority from my perspective. So, but generally, it looks like a good style of cooperation. Many projects, of course, projects in a armored vehicle sphere and others. So this is what I'm thinking about that. Yeah, thank you.
Jill.
Well, thanks for asking a question about Canada. So I just want to say that, from the outset of the war, Canada has been in the language of the Canadian government. I can say I'm very proud to say has been clear and stark, saying that we're in it to help Ukraine fight and win. So there's no equivocation there. We just delivered 2 Leopard tanks. We're adding another couple there. There's 200 senators.
200?
No, two Leopards and 2 more are going. I was about to say there's 200 Senator armored personnel carriers that have been delivered. We just purchased at the beginning of January NASAM system from the United States with the munitions. We sent M777s, small arms, anti-tank stuff, 39 combat armored support vehicles. Of course, we've been training the Ukrainian military since well before the war, and we continue that in Poland and the UK. And Not surprisingly, we've also given them a lot of winter clothing, which, as I say, is something we know something about. So Canada's all in, totals about 5 billion, but that's all in. That's humanitarian, financial, and other. About $1 billion in military support to date. Over.
Okay, thank you. We have an online question from Roman in the Strategic Theater of War. My question is, with all the losses of Russians, 200,000, why have not Russian mothers risen up and demanded Putin has to go? Complicated question, I guess. You can't answer it lightly. Can you do that in a lightning answer?
A lightning, but not lightly. Well, I can't, I'm not certain. I don't think you can give a lightning answer, but there are clear political and cultural inhibitors to the kind of mass demonstration that you would have seen here in the United States or in Canada or in European countries if this kind of losses are there. 200,000 men that we estimate have been killed. God knows how many have been wounded. I have no idea how many have been taken prisoner. But beside that, 300 airplanes, I think, have been lost. 18 ships. I don't know how many tanks, hundreds. This is devastating. This is, years of not just people's lives, but also investment in military just thrown away. Billions of dollars just gone. And it doesn't seem to make an impression on Putin. I'm not surprised because he can't admit to anything. He's also like a Shakespearean villain who has to go forward, but he has apparently total control. And all these guys around him know that if he goes, they go, unless they take him out themselves, which they don't have the guts to do, apparently. So why aren't the mothers protesting? I don't know, but maybe we'll have to wait until they don't have bread, like 1917.
I don't know who is waiting longer. Okay, you and then the gentleman behind you will go to him afterwards. So please be patient. And then are there any questions on this side of the room? One here on the front. So we got 3 questions. Sir.
Okay, I got a quick question about the role of the Dnieper River. So recently I've heard more and more reports of Russians.
Dnieper.
So Dnieper. The Russians have been sending the Shahed drones following the passage of the river, and they made it far enough north to Cherkasy or even Kiev. This is particularly important for me because my mom's apartment is 100 meters from the river. And if this passage is so well known, is there a reason why the Russians keep doing this again and again?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that Russians will use this, route. Why? Because for drones, it's the modernized, Shahed types of drones based on their own, facilities to change, cruise direction, but it's not easy to change altitude. So this is why this for them it's more convenient to use such kind of softwares to achieve some place, for example, Kiev and other cities there. And but on the other hand, we understand that, and probably what last attacks, drones attacks using this direction are unsuccessful version. So they try again to modernize that. But to move through different areas, but some of the attacks were failed because again they have a very limited ability for maneuver on altitude, and as well as they don't have a guided system which can change the target during the flight. So it's previously installed, and this is why they have failed in attacks against maneuverable assets and only can just hit objects of infrastructure. But again, We found another approach is, first of all, it's Maskerovka, and on the other hand, it's mobile groups which can move because it's a quite slow speed. They can understand from this direction after detection of such asset in this direction, it can move and just rapidly move, mobile air defense groups in this direction and destroy such assets. But it's, it's always or war of different, measures, means between different measures and countermeasures. They both sides demonstrate the dynamics here. But again, I would stress what last drones attacks, they are not successful as they planned, as it was just in the beginning of such attacks in last year, in autumn of last year. Thank you.
No, there was a question over here. Let me just go to this side of the room and to be balanced.
Sure, thanks.
Is there a microphone?
I think.
This microphone is there.
Andy has the microphone, so. Oh, well, we should have let him out.
Yeah.
Give it no, come on back. All right, it's just like bouncing, following the bouncing ball. So this, here, go ahead.
Let me see if I can project it out. Can everyone hear me? So, two questions for the Admiral. One, can you tell me the status of that
And
bridge?
who are you?
So this is Howard Altman from the War Zone.
Okay.
And two questions. One, the status of that bridge that was attacked by the drones, the sea drone. And second, the bigger question is, how big is that sea drone program by the Russians, and how far can they project attacks using that? Can you talk about that?
Status of how drones, sea drones program, it's on the development. And as I mentioned before, our government, find, money. It's $500 million of dollars for allocated in this year, fiscal year for, drones, let's say, development creation program. And, sea drones are there in this program. We will see new capabilities soon, more advanced and more effective, because lessons learned from previous use of such an assets. In terms of Russia, they have also abilities to produce such drones, because they have, even in Crimea, they have facilities. They have an R&D facilities for development of such assets. I think what they use, they right now, they intensify, from my perspective, the creation of such assets. So again, it looks like competition. And again, I would stress what we should not gift the Russians to win in this competition, because it's too important from my perspective. It's a good asymmetric assets for us to win the war at sea.
The status of the bridge?
Status of
the bridge?
Bridge in Zatoka Bridge?
Yes.
You mean? It's under renovation right now. I think it will renovate soon, because for one drone attack, it's from my perspective not easy to destroy it all bridge. It was created as a sustainable, assets was during the Soviet Union time, and so I'm not sure what it's this destroyed for forever. Soon it will be renovated, but Russian new attacks are predictable.
This attack on the Zatoka Bridge, what do you think the submerged vehicle used by the Russians had enough charges to blow up? It didn't do much damage, right?
Yeah,
it was just very superficial damage.
It's a good question, but it's a question of because if he would have a more explosion on a board of such vehicle, it would less, one of important his, tactical, advantage. It's a low signature, being not detectable for, protection measures. And of course, it is important to understand which kind of control system, guided system you should use, because if it would be used based on a satellite, communication, it could be jammed. So from my perspective, such assets are small. They don't have enough, for example, for one assets to destroy such a infrastructure objects. So, but for the future, I think what massive, when they will create a just large number of such assets, it would be new attacks against this and other, coastal infrastructure objects. We should be ready. We should understand this, provide, countermeasures, should be ready for that.
Thank you. To keep moving, we've already called on new ones. This gentleman's been waiting, so sorry, Peter.
Thank you. This is Dr. Fink with Exovera. I have a question for the Admiral, but of course would love input from other guys in the panel. What's your assessment of the performance of Russia's naval caliber strike force in terms of, is Russia getting a return on its investment? And then this is a comment disguised as a question. Is there any relevance to that strike force, not just to Ukraine's security, but to Eastern Europe and even the Western Med, especially after the end of the INF treaty?
Yeah.
And last, would it be at all feasible for the Ukrainian Navy to blunt this threat physically? And if so, what kind of tools would it need? The threat emanating out of Novorossiysk.
I don't think they have a Navy, do they?
From my perspective, it's quite effective. No, if you are speaking about long range, cruise missiles, it's quite effective assets to strike against not moving station, objects of infrastructure. They're using that, but of course, right now they have a limited abilities because they used a lot before. And of course, what they created, some part of their Black Sea Fleet capabilities, some strike part of these capabilities, it based mostly based on corvettes, missile corvettes program. And of course, they have a couple corvettes. They have a couple corvettes, missile corvettes there. So it's in number, they can keep at sea on a patrolling at sea, just simultaneously from not from 10 up to 24. Missiles are ready to launch with on board of deployed at sea ships. So they also, such missiles are nuclear capable, so they can carry nuclear warhead, and they trained their personnel to use such assets as well. I mean, crews. How to counteract, which kind of countermeasures should be provided. So different, ground-based missile defense assets, as well as a different platform deployed at coast areas. I think it is important to have this, but also it's possible to hit this missile by manpads, because the speed is not so huge, and it can be observed by mobile groups, mobile air defense groups, deployed on pickups, on other mobile assets on board of pickups and other mobile assets. So from my perspective, should use different assets to protect our objects of infrastructure. So to be creative, to be innovative, and not only rely on just traditional, air defense assets, ground-based air defense assets, and our experience evidence what this approach is working well.
for the benefit of the audience, the Caliber is a dual capable sea launched intermediate range missile. The first part of your question is, are they getting maximum return on their investment for the Caliber? I would say no, because the Caliber's main purpose, although it is to use to conform to the naval doctrine requirement for ship-to-shore missile capability, is that it's not achieving a strategic effect. I mean, they are pounding Ukrainian infrastructure from land, sea, air, every way possible, and it's not working. I mean, they're destroying objects, and they've taken out about some order of magnitude of Ukrainian power generation and so forth, but it's not having the strategic effect. So it's obviously not working, and it's what's more, it's not deterring Western support, which is a dual capable missile. The threat of it going nuclear is always there. Second, apart from what Admiral Kabanenko said about, defensive capabilities to take out the missile, I would also argue that you could use if you have them, precision long-range strike to take out the carriers. That is the ships themselves, which are launching these things from ports in the Black Sea. And I think that doing that would also significantly degrade further Russian naval capabilities there, and also make it harder for them to defend Crimea against a possible future Ukrainian offensive. So I think that answers your question, or was there a third part to it? No.
And
I'm worried that
you got one more question. I'd like to use my prerogative as chair. And Ihor, and this is kind of a larger strategic question, is that, I mean, Steve, you've studied the Russian military for decades. Ihor, you served in the Soviet Army or Soviet Navy. Question is that has Russia lost the ability militarily to innovate? This disaster and what they're undergoing with their army, is this something that they'll be able to come out of and then adapt to, or is this, do you think it's just something more deeper and systemic in the Russian military that you've never seen before or even anticipated?
Well, I think the only thing I didn't anticipate was that they would actually perform so badly, because I would certainly.
Well, we know that, but
Yeah,
I mean, do you think they'll come out of this?
I think the precondition for that is a change of regime. Because, I mean, this is putting on my crystal, my prophecy hat. And, since I identify with Jeremiah because no one listened to what I had to say about it, I can pretend to be a prophet. But the question is profound. It's, there's not enough time to give you the real answer you deserve. But basically, I think they have lost the ability to innovate strategically as long as this regime is in power. One of the reasons is the corruption, the incompetence, and the poor quality of both command and now, I suspect, soldiery, because of the losses they've had and the way their training is set up. Is another thing here. I think they think about war in a really profound way, but students of the Russian military have known for a long time that what they think about is not what they do, because they can't do it. The most original military, go back in history, the most original military thinking in Europe in the interwar period was Soviet, by far. They killed all those generals, and if you look at their performance up till 42, it was abysmal. And they actually didn't survive because they had, quote, limitless armies and lend-lease. But after 42, the command had experience, they'd learned, they had to get more confidence. Stalin had developed more confidence in his commanders. So they were able to innovate and win the huge victories that started coming after Stalingrad. However, now it's not possible. The military thinking, I think, will continue to search for innovative and original solutions and thoughts about the nature and character of war in our time. But in terms of praxis, we are not seeing anything like what a good Marxist would call the unity of theory and practice. And I think as long as Putin is in there, this is not going to work. In the longer term of Russian history, I wrote actually that the Russian attack on Crimea, in a sense, confirmed the Russian historian Platonov, the great historian of the time of troubles, who said that every revolution in Russia leads to the kind of creation of a new state and a new army to match it. And the Crimea, I thought, was the army to match the state. This, I think, is going to set up a revolutionary crisis, if not a revolution, in Russia in time. And the army is going to collapse and be defeated. Only then, when the army has been defeated and the regime, I think, has been unseated and you have new leadership, where you get a truly tactically and operationally and maybe strategically innovative Russian army, as opposed to Russian military thinking, which will continue to be innovative.
Ihor, you want to weigh in?
Yes, I agree with that. They demonstrated this very poor abilities for some innovative approaches. But I think it's here we should understand what does it mean for them, innovative, to be innovative. I think what they only concentrate the efforts of some kind of masquerade deception, just in other tools, what they think what they are unusual, because generally the approach is still continue to be the same as it was the same as it was during the Second World War. This mass army, mass approach, mass, attacks with wave, type of attacks, the front attacks, and the first line, if they don't care about, main power and so on. This is the approach, because they think what in this way they can win. So they have a poor, techniques. They extracted all military techniques what they had on their warehouses since from 60s, 70s, aviation as well. So they're poor condition, and now hence they don't have to change their strategy in an innovative way. I think what we can observe right now. So we should be, again, from our side, based on this assessment, we should be innovative as much as possible, asymmetric, non-linear, and this is way I think to win this war. Thank you.
Okay. All right. On that note, Walter, we're adjourning for lunch.
Yes, we are.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Ms. Jill, I think that we left Ms. Jill out, but I think.
Oh, Jill, thank you. Sorry.
Sorry.
Yes, but actually,